The Battle of Kinsale produced total disaster for the native Irish. The unity that had been built up by O'Neill was now broken. O'Neill returned home to Ulster and sued for peace, but the terms were refused. Lord Deputy Mountjoy launched attacks on Tyrone. Isolated and alone, the Irish knew they were fighting a losing battle against an army that was better trained and equipped. To symbolize the end of the O'Neill dynasty, Mountjoy ordered the destruction of their inauguration chair at Tullahog. The Earl of Tyrone burned his castle at Dungannon. The great O'Neill fled to the woods. He was now an outlaw in a land that was falling apart. Mountjoy's secretary recorded the onset of famine.
The common sort of the rebels were driven to unspeakable extremities, beyond the record of most histories that I ever did read. No spectacle was more frequent in the ditches of towns, and especially in wasted countries, than to see multitudes of these poor people dead, with their mouths all colored green by eating nettles, docks, and all things they could rend of above ground.
At the end of March 1603, Hugh O'Neill felt he had no other choice but to surrender to the crown. The Ulster chieftains were no longer all-powerful local rulers. Now they were landlords, subject to the king's will. They also had many enemies. The Ulster men knew that they would be the victims should the government decide to reverse its policy of reconciliation. Their insecurity was such that in September 1607, the flower of the Gaelic nobility gathered at Rathmullen, County Donegal. Led by O'Neill, they were about to sail for the continent, never to return. It was a disastrous event for Gaelic Ireland, known to this day as the Flight of the Earls.
When James I of England decided that plantation was the only solution for rebellious Ulster, he called the 12 chief trade guilds in London to help in his grand design. Between them, the guilds took over 63% of all the land in County Derry, established the present city, and added the prefix London to Londonderry. When Charles II died in 1685, Protestant England trembled in anticipation because their new king, James, the brother of Charles, was a Catholic. It was widely suspected that James was in league with the Pope in an attempt to roll back the tide of Protestantism. In 1688, James issued a declaration removing the discriminatory laws against Catholics and dissenters. Cartoons showing James's ambassador kissing the foot of the Pope were not calculated to quiet public fears. The attempts by the king to remove the penal laws were strongly resisted by clergy of the Church of England. James foolishly tried coercion, sending 7 bishops to the Tower to await trial. His action raised a popular outcry, and the courts eventually set the bishops free in defiance of the king. The day after the bishops were released, a formal invitation was sent by the Protestant nobility to William of Orange, James's Dutch son-in-law, asking him to lead a rebellion in support of the Protestant cause. William landed in England in November, and James fled to France without striking a blow for his throne. The coronation of William and Mary set the seal on the glorious revolution of 1688. In the meantime, the Lord Deputy of Ireland, Richard Talbot, Duke of Tyrconnell, sought to hold the country for James. A garrison was sent to Derry. The city fathers were prepared to let them in, but at the last moment, some apprentice boys seized the keys and slammed the gates. In March 1689, James landed in Kinsale and marched on Derry, but the city held out against him. Not having the guns to break through the walls, James tried to starve the inhabitants into submission. The defenders suffered greatly from lack of food, but on the 30th of July 1689, the relief ship, the Mountjoy, burst through the barrier across the river and brought in supplies. The siege was over, and James returned to Dublin. Along with the Battle of the Boyne, the closing of Derry's gates has become the most significant event in the folk history of the Protestant community in Northern Ireland.
Ever since the Siege of Derry in 1689, Londonderry has held a special place in the Unionist psyche. The Maiden City, so called because her walls remained unbreached throughout the siege, was a beacon for the steadfast determination of the Irish Protestant settlers of the 17th century to remain in the land that they had come to call home.
It's almost as if in one small corner of Northern Ireland, the battle for liberty was fought before we got to the Boyne. So that's why the siege and the unbreached walls were so important and are so important in the whole psyche of the Protestant community.